In this video essay we will have a look at the narrative function of music in the film Night of the Hunter. But before we jump into that, we need to define some terms and expressions and look at the history of music and sound in cinema. In the period of 1853 to 1869, the German composer Richard Wagner popularized the use of leitmotif in music. But what is a leitmotif? Mark Richard, who has a PhD in music theory, calls it a recurring melody that is associated with a certain character, people, object, place, emotion, or idea. Now let's move on to the term theme. Mark Richard continues, to say that a leitmotif is short does not mean that it can start out as or develop into something longer. Indeed, many of the leitmotifs of classic Hollywood are true themes of more than a bar or two of music. So a theme can be a continuation of a leitmotif, like we can hear in Indiana Jones. In the 1920s, synchronized dialogue was introduced in film. First, there were only short films that had dialogue, and there were also feature-length films with sound effects and music. But it was first in 1927 that the first original film with synchronized dialogue, The Jazz Singer, was presented to the public. Music and sound has had a long and complicated journey in film history, but these are some of the most important aspects we need to take with us. If you want to learn more, I suggest you read the book Film Music by Peter Larsen. Sound and film together became more and more popular, and soon Hollywood got hold of classically trained composers from all over the world, but specifically Europe, where Wagner came from. Composers from Europe were familiar with Romanticism, the period Wagner worked in, and some of these composers had a background in opera. Therefore it wasn't strange that they continued and were inspired by this period in music history. So what does all of this have to do with Night of the Hunter from 1955? Well, in 1955, leitmotifs were a well-established tool for composers. Movie makers had been experimenting with sound and music since the 1920s, and they had understood the potential sound and music had in conveying a story together with the pictures. And it's precisely this we will look into, the narrative function of music in Night of the Hunter. We will of course not look at every instance of this, because that would probably fill up an entire book. We will focus on a few selected leitmotifs and themes that occurs throughout the entire film, including a psalm that is used frequently. We will not look at all the times that these are used, but the most essential and interesting moments where these play together with other techniques. Femicidal Reverend Harry Powell from the southern states of the US exploits his profession so that he can marry a naive young lady, Mrs. Harper, who just lost her husband, Mr. Harper. Harry does this because he knows that Mrs. Harper's husband hid away $10,000 that he stole from a bank and the police never found. Harry starts to suspect that the children know where the money is hid and starts to terrorize them. So let's start from the beginning with the opening title, and here they don't waste a single moment. The music, more than the pictures, explain all we need to know about the characters and the tone of the movie. When we see Robert Mitchum's name, we can hear a leitmotif we will call the Hunter's leitmotif. And this leitmotif is also playing over the title of the film, which then suggests that Mitchum is the so-called hunter the title is referring to. The Hunter's leitmotif evolves into what we can call the Hunter's theme. We can split up this theme into two parts, A and B. Part A is the Hunter's leitmotif, and we know this because it is used frequently throughout the film to establish the hunter, where he is, and what he has done. We will come back to this. Part B goes over to light instruments like the violin with swift tempo, like they're trying to escape. And this part of the theme is later used for exactly this purpose. Part B also plays over the name of Shelley Winters, which is one of the victims of Harry Powell. After the Hunter's theme comes what we can refer to as the Innocence leitmotif. And the Innocence leitmotif evolves into the Innocence theme.
Dream, little one, dream.
So what does these leitmotifs tell us? The Hunter's leitmotif sounds scary and dangerous, and the Innocence leitmotif sounds, funny enough, innocent and sweet. But why? The Hunter's leitmotif consists of low brass instruments and drums like timpani. These are instruments most commonly found in the score of war movies and horror films. The melody in the leitmotif is in the minor scale, a scale that is often interpreted as scary, sad and dark, even though that isn't always the case. So already in the opening, some of the viewers can form hypotheses of who the bad guys are, who the good guys are, and that this movie is going to be about some kind of good versus evil. And one can even infer that since the Hunter's theme comes first, followed by the Innocence theme, that the story will first look dark, but the good guys will win in the end. The binary design of the opening title music was well enough established so that the audiences would be able to pick out these leitmotifs from the opening credits. And of course, the star's billing would tell them who to look for in their respective roles. Another point I want to make here. Main title cues were often cast in a two-part form. The opening A theme was associated with the title of the film. It may or may not refer to a specific character, that is, a male lead, or setting. It may simply signify the genre and tone of the picture. However, the B theme, typically with reduced orchestration, dynamics, and more lyrical in character, is often associated with the female lead. If we imagine that the composer Walter Schumann used this as a framework, which is highly likely since Robert Mitchum's name comes before the main title, which tells us that he is the main character, and this hunter that the title refers to. We can see that the hunter's theme, the A theme, represent both the main character and the title, and to some degree, the female lead. While the Innocence theme, the B theme, represents the secondary characters, who are the real counterpart / main lead to Robert Mitchum. And it's not only Mr. and Mrs. Harper's kids, John and Pearl, who fit into this innocent category, but also the dead wife of Uncle Birdie.
Dead and gone these 25 years, never takes a rise off me.
This B theme also have lyrics which are sung in the opening title.
Dream, little one, dream.
We also get a reduction in the dynamics and a reduction in the use of instruments in the music. So for the most part, this quote seems to fit well with the opening title of the film, which again says to us that the composer is obviously inspired by earlier composers in Hollywood and follows a lot of the ideas they developed. Let's have a look at how Schumann uses the hunter's leitmotif throughout the film with a basis of narrative function.
What's wrong? Hey! Hey!
In this clip they use the hunter's leitmotif before we've even seen Mitchum as Harry, but he's been introduced in the opening and he's going to be introduced again. The director and the composer tries to make a connection between this dead woman and the hunter. They are trying to tell us that he has murdered her, without showing it or telling us about it, connecting it only with the help of music and editing. Like it says in the book Film Art, while watching the film, the viewer picks up cues, recalls information, anticipates what will follow, and generally participates in the creation of the film's form. Film is a dynamic activity where the viewer several times make hypotheses and infers things that will happen from the information they are given. And the filmmaker uses this information to his or her advantage also in the music department. The next time we hear the hunter's leitmotif is in a scene that uses cross-cutting. Cross-cutting, as explained in film art, is cutting from a clip of an event one place to a clip of an event another place, and these events usually happens at the same time. Mrs. Harper has lost her husband, who has been hanged, and a lot indicates that Harry is trying to find Mrs. Harper to get the money, but he hasn't said anything about it, and we haven't seen him make any travel arrangements. But while Mrs. Harper is talking to Mrs. Spoon about a potential new husband, the film crosscuts to a black train in full speed, and with the hunter's leitmotif playing. Again, the leitmotif is used for narrative purposes. It tells us that the hunter is aboard the train and the train is coming toward Mrs. Harper. Of course, the dialogue and the editing works together with the music to help us infer this. And later, when Harry shows up outside Mrs. Harper's house, all of these hypotheses are confirmed. The leitmotif together with the cross-cutting give us as viewers a sense of distress, unease, and a feeling of evil coming towards good. The next use of the hunter's leitmotif is in the scene where the children are introduced to Harry. Harry's shadow walks into the frame and the leitmotif follows. The only things telling us this is Harry is the shape of the shadow and the music. And again we infer and make hypotheses about this being Harry. While we are talking about this scene, let's look a bit closer at the technique called diegetic and non-diegetic sound. The leitmotif is an example of non-diegetic sound. Non-diegetic sound is sound that takes place outside the story world. Us viewers don't expect to see an orchestra right around the corner when we hear a film score, and we don't really think about it that much. In the same scene, Harry starts singing a song that has an important part in this movie, the psalm Leaning on the Everlasting Arms, and this is diegetic sound. It takes place in the story world. Harry sings it here and now.
Just a minute.
And here this song gets a frightening effect. And if we didn't understand who killed Mrs. Harper, this makes it obvious. This is not what they call off-screen sound, because we know Harry isn't nearby. So here a diegetic sound becomes non-diegetic, but goes over to diegetic in the next scene. The line between fantasy and reality becomes distorted, and this is an effect used throughout the film, both in the music and the visuals. The third time we hear Leaning on the Everlasting Arms, we know this song bears no good with it. There's a lot of similarities between this time and the previous times we heard it, but the difference is that Lawton, the director, uses off-screen sound here, like we talked about earlier. We can hear Harry before we see him, but this time it's always what we call diegetic sound. For all we know, Harry might not even be there. But like earlier, our hypotheses about him being right around the corner are confirmed by the following clip of him riding into frame. One would think that this is non-diegetic sound, since we can hear Harry before we see him, but this is, as stated, off-screen sound, which is a category under diegetic sound. Just like we know there is something beyond the frames of the story world, there is also sound beyond those frames, and this is off-screen sound. This is used differently and with different goals from movie to movie, but one could argue that the most important goal for a filmmaker is that one can get a relatively small scene to feel very large, and with this the director can save a lot of money. The example used in film art is: a couple is sitting in airplane seats, people talk in the background, and a beverage cart is rolling up and down inside the airplane. We then make a picture in our mind of the airplane being filled up and in the air. This is of course not the way it's been used in Night of the Hunter. Here we get to see where the sound is coming from. But what Lawton can do here is grab our attention and point it towards Harry without having to show him in frame. We discover Harry together with John and only get to see him from John's angle. Lawton could have cut to Harry watching John or a more objective angle, but Lawton chooses to focus only on the children, and the effect of this is that we get to feel their fear. In the same scene, another interesting thing happens. In the moment John and Pearl makes a run for it, the hunter's leitmotif starts to play on top of Leaning on the Everlasting Arms, and we can clearly hear the similarities between the two. We can in that regard say that Harry has two leitmotifs, or themes. One diegetic, which is Leaning on the Everlasting Arms, and one non-diegetic, which is the hunter's leitmotif/theme. His diegetic leitmotif doesn't only make us aware of his presence, but also the children, and here diegetic and non-diegetic sound cooperates. And I would make the argument that this shows Harry's intention behind the psalm he uses to praise God, his dubious relationship to religion, and how he constantly abuses his role as a reverend.
What religion you profess, preacher?
The religion the Almighty and me worked out betwixt us.
If you used to let that money serve the Lord's purpose, he might feel kindly turned toward you.
Let's look at the last scene where Harry sings Leaning on the Everlasting Arms, because something interesting happens. The kids end up at the religious woman's house named Mrs. Cooper. Mrs. Cooper takes care of abandoned children and gladly takes on John and Pearl. Harry comes to claim the children, but Mrs. Cooper can tell that Harry isn't really a man of God.
No, and he ain't no preacher neither.
Harry says he will return later to take them by force, and Mrs. Cooper has to guard the house at night. Harry makes his appearance and starts to sing Leaning on the Everlasting Arms.
What a fellowship, what a joy divine, leaning on the everlasting arms.
Earlier on, Mrs. Cooper noticed John's fear for the Bible and anything religious, and she realizes now the reason why. Instead of letting Harry terrorize them with this song, she interferes.
Leaning on Jesus, leaning on Jesus, safe and secure from all alarms. Leaning on Jesus, leaning on Jesus, leaning on the everlasting arms.
She tries to make it her own, to show the kids that this song doesn't have to be mean and fearful, it can be joyous and divine. She takes a song that we as viewers have pinned together with the hunter's leitmotif as something scary and awful, and makes it her own. The Bible and God doesn't have to be used for malicious purposes. It can be used for good. This really shows Charles Lawton's deep and nuanced understanding of religion, and his understanding of how people and institutions may have drastically different relationships and reactions to it. There is no doubt that music has a narrative function in Night of the Hunter. The music works together with other techniques to amplify the message and intention of the scene. It creates a link between scenes and characters. In some cases, it tells us how to feel about a scene, and it makes us create hypotheses about what is going to happen. Something that is often confirmed by the pictures in the next scene. It sets the tone right from the start, and it follows up on this tone throughout the film by repeating leitmotifs and themes, but in a different context and with slight variations. We've briefly looked at where these techniques come from and how they have been used and how they still are used in film. There's no doubt about the influence Wagner has had on film music, and let me end this with a quote from Max Steiner, who is credited as the man who first took the leitmotif approach to making music for films. If Wagner had lived in this century, he would have been the #1 film composer.